The sun had begun to fall behind the pines when the doorbell rang for the third time. Laughter floated in from the front porch as old friends and neighbors stepped into our home arms, filled with homemade casseroles, bottles of wine, and stories they'd rehearsed on the drive over. I smiled, kissed cheeks, refilled glasses, asked after grandchildren I barely remembered. It was my 45th wedding anniversary. I had even bought fresh orchids for the table and used the linen napkins I usually reserved for Easter. Silvio stood in his usual quiet way near the fireplace, nodding warmly at guests, the silver in his beard catching the late light. Every few minutes, his eyes drifted to the door just as mine did. Everyone we'd invited had come except Calder. I waited until I couldn't pretend I wasn't checking my phone. I stepped quietly into the kitchen and dialed. The rings dragged on longer than they should have before he answered. "Yeah," he said, his voice half swallowed by background noise, laughter, clinking plates, the unmistakable echo of a large gathering. "Calder? It's me." I kept my voice light. "Just wondering if you're on your way." A short pause. "Oh, Mom. Right." He sounded like he'd just remembered I existed. Then he added, "I'm at Sabine's family's place. Big thing for her dad's retirement." Totally slipped my mind. "I'll call you tomorrow, okay? Next year we'll do something big. Promise." I opened my mouth, then closed it. "Next year," I repeated softly. But he'd already hung up. I stood still, phone in hand, the hum of the refrigerator now impossibly loud. My hand trembled slightly, not from rage, not yet, but from something deeper. Not surprise either. Just the slow confirmation of a fear I'd stopped naming years ago. "Odile," a voice called from the living room. It was Mrs. Temple, my neighbor for 15 years, who always brought her famous cinnamon bread and believed in showing up for everything. "Is Calder almost here?" I turned, smoothing the lines in my skirt. "Running late," I said, forcing a smile. "But he's on his way." The lie sat warm and bitter on my tongue. I stepped back into the room and poured another glass of wine I didn't want. The candles flickered gently on the mantel. Someone had just started a toast. Silvio raised his glass. From across the room, he met my gaze. He didn't say anything, but he knew. And as I sat down at the long table between laughter and music, with my only son's chair still empty, I began to wonder if the excuses had always been there, just harder to hear when hope was louder. I moved through the party, like someone gliding through fog, smiling, laughing in the right places, thanking people for coming, pretending I didn't hear the awkward pauses whenever someone asked about Calder. The table was full. So many familiar faces, people who had watched Calder grow up, who remembered his little league games and high school debates. They noticed. Of course they did. His absence was loud, even in silence. Silvio, ever the quiet diplomat, kept things moving. He led a toast with a warm steadiness I was grateful for. To 45 years, he set his hand on mine. To weathering storms and still choosing to dance in the rain. I nodded, blinking fast, as the room raised their glasses. I didn't want them to see my eyes. Across from me sat the same chair we'd left for Calder. I hadn't planned it. It just felt wrong to squeeze someone else into that space. Every now and then, someone would glance at it, then look quickly away. By the time dessert was served, the weight of that empty seat had settled into the pit of my stomach like a stone. I escaped to the hallway under the pretense of checking the coffee. Mrs. Temple followed me, pretending to admire a painting she'd seen a dozen times. She leaned in close, lowering her voice. "Odile," she said, "I hope you don't mind me asking, but why hasn't Calder been around lately?" I kept my face even. "Oh, you know. They're busy. Work's demanding. Sabine's family always has something going on. They travel a lot." She gave a small nod, but I could tell she didn't buy it. I didn't either. After she walked away, I stood there for a moment longer, letting the hum of conversation behind me blur into white noise. The hallway felt cooler than the rest of the house. I found myself staring at the old framed photo of Calder in his graduation robe, one arm around me, the other around Silvio. His smile had been real that day. He'd brought me wildflowers, messy, colorful ones from a roadside stand, stems still damp, wrapped in newspaper. He used to call every Sunday morning. Just to chat. Just because. Last month was my birthday. He didn't even send a text. I went back to the kitchen, reheated the coffee no one had asked for, and returned to the table just in time to hear Mrs. Temple telling someone about the upcoming farmer's market. I smiled. I nodded. But even as I poured her a cup, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. Not just forgotten. Removed. The next morning, I decided to drive across town. It had been a week since the anniversary. I told Silvio I was going to the pharmacy near Calder's neighborhood, 30 minutes away, because they carried a brand of arthritis cream I liked. That was only half true. The truth was, I wanted to be near where Calder lived, where maybe I'd feel less like someone exiled from her own family. The store was larger than the ones in our part of town. Brighter. Full of mothers wrangling toddlers and older men comparing brands of soup. I moved through the aisles, slowly letting the cart guide me rather than the other way around. And then, in the cereal aisle, I saw them. Calder, Sabine, and the children. My grandchildren, whom I hadn't seen in almost 5 months. They didn't see me at first. Sabine was crouched, reading the back of a box. Calder stood with a phone in one hand and a toddler balanced on the other hip. The little girl Juna, I remembered, was tugging at his sleeve, pointing toward something. Something in my chest caught. There they were in the middle of an ordinary day, laughing, living close enough to touch. Calder. I said, my voice barely above a whisper. His head snapped up. He froze, and in that first second, I saw it. Not surprise, guilt. He quickly adjusted his expression into something resembling warmth, but it came too late. Mom, what are you doing here? I smiled, already hating myself for how hopeful I sounded. The pharmacy nearby. Just picking up a few things. What a coincidence, isn't it? Sabine stood up, slowly brushing imaginary dust off her slacks. We're actually just heading to my parents'. It's his dad's birthday, and you know how he gets if we're late. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. Oh, I said, nodding. Maybe I could tag along. Just for a bit. I'd love to catch up with the kids. The silence that followed wasn't long in time, but it stretched deep. Calder looked at Sabine. She didn't say anything, just gently touched his arm. He cleared his throat. I don't think that'd work today, Mom. We're kind of tight on time. Another day, maybe. Juna looked up at me, curious. The baby in the cart started to fuss. I nodded again. Of course. I didn't mean to impose. Just nice to see you. Sabine offered a tight-lipped smile. Take care, Odile. They moved on. I stood there, still holding my empty cart, the overhead lights suddenly too bright. My hands were cold. I couldn't remember what I'd come there to buy. When I finally left the store, I didn't go to the pharmacy. I drove home, sat in the car for a long while, and thought about what it meant to be someone's mother, only when it was convenient. 2 days later, Mrs. Temple rang my doorbell with something to tell me. It was late morning when Mrs. Temple knocked, holding a bag of peaches and her usual energy that somehow always filled a room faster than steam from a kettle. I was still in my robe. She came in without asking, like she always did, and set the peaches down as if we were about to bake something. I wasn't going to say anything, she began, her voice lower than usual. But I ran into Edith Claiborne at the market this morning. You know Sabine's aunt. She was talking loud enough for the fruit vendors to hear every word. I turned to face her. She gave me a look equal parts pity and fury. She said Calder treats Sabine's parents like royalty. that he calls them every Sunday without fail, that he paid for their anniversary cruise to Bermuda last year. I said nothing. Mrs. Temple exhaled. Odile, I didn't come to upset you, but I thought you should know. I stood very still. My tea had gone cold on the counter. She continued slower this time. Later, I passed by the florist and heard Sabine talking to someone. Didn't see who. But she said, and I quote, Calder's mom is just needy, always expecting visits. She doesn't understand boundaries. The words didn't land all at once. They drifted in slowly, thick as smoke. Needy, always expecting visits. Doesn't understand boundaries. I looked down at my hands resting on the kitchen counter. They didn't feel like mine. I thought of all the times I hadn't called Calder because I didn't want to interrupt. Of the messages I typed and deleted. Of the pies I baked, the birthday cards I mailed without reply. The little packages for the kids I dropped off on their porch when no one answered. Mrs. Temple reached for my wrist gently. You are not needy, she said. You're a mother who wants to be in her son's life. I nodded, but I couldn't speak. She stayed a few more minutes, made more tea, and talked about the upcoming neighborhood cleanup, as if we were both in that world, the one where everyone's place was still intact. After she left, I sat by the window for a long time. I watched the wind move through the hydrangeas Silvio had planted the spring Calder was born. I thought of Sabine's family, how easily they had become Calder's world. I thought of Sunday mornings and how quiet my phone had become. The next day, I picked it up and dialed anyway. I waited 3 days before I made the call. 3 days pretending I hadn't heard those words in the market. 3 days of convincing myself that perhaps Mrs. Temple had misheard, or that Sabine had spoken in frustration, or that Calder didn't really mean to forget my birthday, or the anniversary, or the dozen other small erasures that had become too frequent to count. When he answered, there was noise in the background, keyboard clacks, voices, the hum of something fast-paced and important. Is this serious? He said. I'm in the middle of a meeting. I swallowed. I just wanted to hear your voice. A pause. Okay. Well, I'm here. How are the kids? I asked as gently as I could. They're good. Busy. School and activities and all that. And Sabine. She's fine. Each answer landed with the efficiency of a door shutting. I kept my tone even. I thought maybe you could come for lunch this weekend. I'll make your favorite. Just a simple meal. He didn't respond right away. I imagined him glancing at his calendar or pretending to. We're really booked, he said finally. Maybe next month. Something inside me loosened, not a tear or a sob, just a kind of quiet shift. Like I'd let go of something I didn't realize I'd been holding. Calder, I said, my voice lower than before. Do you even want to come? Or are you just too polite to say no? There was a beat of silence. Then a sigh. Mom, can we not do this now? I nodded, even though he couldn't see me. Of course. I'll call you later, okay? He said. Already. Fading. Okay. The line went dead. I sat with the phone in my lap for a long time after. Not crying. Not angry. Just still. Because somewhere between all the missed Sundays and the quiet omissions, my son had stopped seeing me as someone worth showing up for. And yet, someone had just shown up at my front door. It was just after noon when the doorbell rang. I hadn't been expecting anyone. I thought it might be Mrs. Temple again, or perhaps Silvio coming back early from the hardware store. But when I opened the door, a man in a navy blazer stood there holding a leather folder and wearing a polite, practiced expression. Mrs. Renner, yes. My name is Anthony Marsh. I'm with Jackson County Adult Protective Services. My stomach dropped before my mind even caught up. He cleared his throat. We received a report, an anonymous concern, ma'am, regarding your cognitive health. I'd just like to ask a few questions if that's all right. I stared at him, a concern from who I'm not permitted to say. The report came from someone identifying as a close family member. I stepped aside and let him in. My hands felt oddly steady. I offered him a seat at the dining table, the one where Calder used to do his homework while I made dinner. Mr. Marsh asked about my daily routines medications, whether I'd ever gotten lost or forgotten appointments. I answered everything calmly. I even offered to show him my kitchen calendars, my neatly labeled pill organizer, the bills I still pay by check every first of the month. He nodded throughout, jotting notes, occasionally glancing up at me with a slight crease in his brow. "You seem well organized, Mrs. Renner, and very lucid," he said, finally. "I manage just fine," I replied. "I've been managing for a long time." He stood and closed his folder. "This is likely just a precaution. These things come up, sometimes confusion, misunderstandings. Still, if you notice anything unusual, please don't hesitate to reach out." I walked him to the door. He thanked me again, said he'd follow up in writing, and left. I didn't need to ask who filed the report. I knew. Calder hadn't just forgotten my birthday. He hadn't just avoided another anniversary. He was preparing the world to believe I couldn't care for myself. I closed the door softly, leaned against it for a long moment, and stared out across the quiet street. And then I picked up the phone and called Mrs. Temple. Mrs. Temple didn't ask questions when I told her I needed the name of a lawyer who didn't gossip and didn't flinch easily. She scribbled down a name, underlined it twice, and slid it across my kitchen table like we were in a spy film. I made an appointment the next morning. The office was small, quiet, tucked above a florist shop downtown. The attorney, Mr. Lewin, was in his 60s and had the calm presence of someone who'd seen everything and knew when not to ask why. He listened while I spoke. I didn't raise my voice once. I told him I wanted to cancel my will. He asked why. I told him that the person named in it had started building a case to take control of my life. He didn't blink. "Do you want to draft a new one?" "No," I said. "Let the state handle what's left. I just want to make sure Calder gets nothing without a fight." He nodded. "That's clear." I also asked about my accounts, what could be done to prevent someone from accessing them without my knowledge. He gave me instructions, and by that afternoon, I was sitting in front of a bank manager I'd known for over 2 decades. "No joint access," I told her, "and I want a security code added for all large transactions." "Any word you'd like?" she asked. "Wisteria," I said. "My mother's favorite flower. One Calder never learned to pronounce as a child." Over the next week, I hired a private investigator. I paid him in cash and told him I didn't need gossip. I needed facts. It didn't take long. He came back with photos, emails, notes from a tour of a senior care facility 20 minutes from my house, a pre-registration form, my name written neatly under potential resident, my son's signature below. And then there were copies of messages between Calder and a legal advisor inquiring about how to expedite guardianship proceedings in the event of emerging mental decline. Every page made my hands colder. Every line confirmed what I'd hoped I was wrong about. At home, I laid everything out on the dining room table. I found an old cardboard box in the hall closet, cleared out the winter scarves that hadn't seen daylight in years, and began placing the documents inside carefully, methodically. The photos, the facility brochure, the legal queries. At the very top, I placed a handwritten note on thick stationery. Read this first. I sealed the box with packing tape, wrote Calder's name across the top, and slid it under the table. And then I called the courier service. He arrived just after 6 in the evening. I heard the car tires skid against gravel, then footsteps across the porch, quick, uneven, almost frantic. When I opened the door, Calder stood there, breathless, holding the box. His tie was loose shirt, half untucked. Face pale, like he'd seen something he couldn't quite process. "Mom," he said, the word catching on his tongue. "What is this?" He shook the box slightly. "How could you send this?" I didn't answer. I stepped aside and let him in. He dropped the box on the table as if it had weight beyond the paper inside. This is insane. You hired someone to follow me. You went through my How did you even? I sat down. Open the envelope. He froze. I tapped the top of the box. It's labeled. Read it. Out loud. He stared at me, jaw tightening. But then, with a breath that sounded almost like surrender, he tore the seal and pulled out the letter. His eyes moved across the page. The muscles in his face twitched. He kept reading slower now. At one point, he blinked hard. Then again. When he finished, he didn't speak right away. He just looked at me, stunned, wounded, exposed. I stood, walked to the window, and pulled back the curtain. The last light of day was sinking into the horizon, streaking the sky with quiet oranges and fading blue. Behind me, Calder said my name like it was both a question and an apology. I didn't turn around. Instead, I asked him to sit down. We needed to talk.